Hello everyone, my name is Sarah Louise Vert, and this is my presentation on Oddities as Commodities, Origins and Analysis of American Believe It or Not Culture. From the British Museum to roadside tourist traps, anthropological museum history has been full of controversy. Within advertising, description of items, and acquisition of artifacts, controversial methods and language have been consistently used. Perhaps most unique, however, is the cultivation of American Believe It or Not culture. With the mythology of the bizarre and morbid, as well as the rise of road trip culture and safe exploration, there is a uniquely American market based in museum history for the commodification of oddities. Additionally, with the image of the wealthy eccentric capitalist present in the United States, it is not uncommon to see fascination with curiosity culture. The fascination with the bizarre is easily capitalized on, as was discovered at the turn of last century. People could easily take advantage of the draw oddities had. However, this continues into today. As seen here, there is a display of shrunken heads at Ye Olde Curiosity Shop on the Seattle waterfront, owned and operated by the Stanley family since 1899. This display is full of both authentic shrunken heads from the Amazonian rainforest, as well as Victorian-era replicas created to capitalize off of American fascination with the practice. While we as a society believe this to be a relic, opposite this case is a recent Etsy listing for a shrunken head necklace made of plastic, on sale by an Australian artist for the equivalent of $16. Historically, museums were created by the wealthy. Collections of items from far-off lands or highly valued artwork were kept for personal enjoyment. Umbros Castle in Austria, pictured here, is considered to be one of the oldest private collections in the world. There is a rich and unique history of wealth and preservation of art in this building, which is thought to have been designed primarily as storage for these personal collection items. Personal collections became public, and soon museums became centers for preservation. Preservation eventually turned into education. Museums slowly became centers for research and spreading of ideas. The public was drawn to the promise of education on things beyond themselves and the ability to see and experience firsthand things that they would never have been able to consider otherwise. The Smithsonian Institution was founded in the United States in 1846 in order to combine and preserve information. But with the rise of responsible preservation came capitalist ventures and more eccentric collections of items designed to draw in the masses and cause shock. The fascination with oddity begins with a walrus. At the turn of the last century, taxidermy was growing significantly as both an art form and an educational tool. As people traveled, they took trophy skins to show the world their discoveries from the outside. Unfortunately, things were lost in translation. The piece pictured here, often simply referred to as Horniman's walrus, has been displayed in the Horniman Museum for over a century. The grotesquely smooth beast was created by a taxidermist who had never seen a live walrus. He was simply given the skin and told to restuff the animal. As a result, the walrus came out wrinkle-free, overstuffed, and much larger than an actual walrus would be. This walrus drew large crowds and created an appeal for the museum. As evidenced by their website, the piece continues to draw crowds specifically because of its strange and inaccurate nature. With the rise of taxidermy came confusion and disbelief. Upon the discovery of the duck-billed platypus and its subsequent taxidermy introduction, many believed it to be an elaborate fake. This is significant as it shows a change in the way that people thought about taxidermy and the unfamiliar. It also shows a level of distrust and a differentiation in the way that people viewed museums, because despite the disbelief, people were interested in the platypus. Some were attracted to this confusion, and so it marked an opening for counterfeit pieces specifically designed to draw in crowds. Two-headed animals, stretched skin into strange shapes, and combinations became significantly more common. One of the most famous pieces is the Fiji mermaid, half fish, half monkey skin, displayed in sideshows. Shown above is one of the originals, thought to have been created for P.T. Barnum's museum in Connecticut. The East Coast began to establish an affinity for oddities at the turn of the century, with permanent boardwalks full of oddities and people with unusual talents or deformities. These people and items were often given exotic names based on the mystification and fetishization of other cultures. This has only contributed to the interest and the differences the world had to offer. The draw of artifacts was too much for many to resist, and as a result, it was incredibly easy to capitalize on. Phineas Taylor Barnum was an entrepreneur first and foremost, who took advantage of this capitalization. His museum in Connecticut held a variety of oddities, many of them taxidermy fabrications or artifacts from other cultures. He also hired many human acts, primarily people with deformities. However, some were also performers with unique talents. P.T. Barnum eventually partnered with James Anthony Bailey in order to tour the country and spread his oddities onward. In the early days of the United States, the idea of manifest destiny inspired people to think about what was in the world beyond them. While the country itself was massive and wild in a way that many had never thought to explore, it also opened the door to wonder about other cultures. Well, with this curiosity came the recognition that Middle America was, as to kindly put it, very boring. A majority of people spent their lives on farms, not having very much social interaction with other people or the world around them. Small-scale events like fairs and carnivals were the only real exposure that people had to entertainment. Capitalists like P.T. Barnum, who had previously spent their time in solitary museums or carnivals on the East Coast, were now mobilizing their sideshows, bringing their freaks and oddities to Middle America. With this, their exhibits got more elaborate as to bring in larger crowds. Sideshows were a specific art form of secondary attractions that often accompanied fairs. Fairs in the Midwest were often primarily designed for selling and showing of goods locally. However, circus acts and oddities were often presented as well in order to draw in larger crowds. These shows often included artifacts of questionable authenticity or ethicality, and human acts, often featuring disabled people. The exploitation of human remains was also not unpopular during these acts. Some settled in specific, highly populated areas, but often sideshow acts continued onward, out further west. On the West Coast, oddities flourished. Places in the Pacific Northwest had prime trading ability, and as a result, had many exotic wares to offer the public, both for sale and display. In the South, coastal beach towns enjoyed similar success with amusement parks that paralleled the East Coast. Places like Venice Beach and Los Angeles enjoyed thriving boardwalk oddity culture, while places like the Curiosity Shop in Seattle enjoyed commercial success among private collectors and wealthy eccentrics. The United States was thoroughly fascinated with the strange, from sea to shining sea. With a solid establishment, things began to wind down. More ideas on relativism were slowly being introduced, and people began to understand anthropological perspectives. There was more of a taboo on gawking at the unusual. That all changed with a man named Robert Ripley. A cartoon artist, Ripley drew a majority of his inspiration from customs and images from other cultures. He considered himself an amateur anthropologist and believed in creating shocking images in order to draw in crowds. His cartoons grew in popularity, and so did his influence. Beyond his cartoon collections, Ripley began to amass crowds of Barnum-esque collections of items. His legacy continues to live on to this day for revitalizing American oddities. Ripley's industry grew exponentially. Books of his cartoons became widely accessible, and with the rise of radio shows in the 1930s, it was easier than ever to hear about the wild world beyond what Americans were used to. Films were produced showcasing strange events and customs, as well as individuals with remarkable and shocking differences in abilities. In the late 40s and early 50s, Ripley brought his message to the smaller screen, making it easier than ever to satisfy morbid curiosity. After his death in 1949, his legacy was continued by his friends and business partners. Different versions of his show were broadcasted later as well, with the most recent iteration releasing this year, in 2019. After sideshows traveled through, the interest remained. As time went by and the world became easier to explore, many created permanent settlements for oddities. This created a specific niche to be filled. Roadside attractions or tourist traps saw an incredible rise mid-century as more people gained access to vehicles. As highways cut through the United States, covering thousands of miles of blank landscape, entrepreneurs found ways to draw attention to themselves. With public broadcasts like Ripley's only adding interest to the unusual, more and more of these roadside attractions began to turn up with increasingly more absurd draws. In the race to find the strangest items, many actual discoveries were made. In a struggle to create accurate replicas of shrunken heads, individuals found major amounts of information about the Amazonian Javaro people and learned to understand their process both physically and religiously of head shrinking. Additionally, the practice of keeping wet specimens in jars of formaldehyde provided scientific understanding of physical deformities that can still be studied. Unfortunately, some discoveries were unethically sourced, fabricated, or full of vile racial and ableist undertones. Some people hired by sideshows were actually enslaved, while many others were mistreated. Additionally, some practices, such as what is often referred to as pickled punks, or fetuses in bell jars, are absolutely reprehensible by today's standards. Despite this, individuals still have a fascination with these sick things, as well as the history behind them. There's a clear idealism around this culture, despite its controversy. The community continues to grow, and with positive outlooks celebrating this interest in oddities spreading, it's easy to fall into the enjoyment. Vintage burlesque model Dita Von Teese is one example of a highly romanticized outlook on this alternative lifestyle. Additionally, romanticized versions of entrepreneurs who characterize the era are slowly becoming more popular, such as 2017's Greatest Showman, which created a highly inaccurate portrayal of P.T. Barnum and his impact on oddity culture. The community surrounding oddities continues on, over a century later. Those fascinated with the morbid and unusual flock to antique preservations of Victorian oddity culture. Places such as Obscura, an antique store in New York that once had its own television show, cater to this specific niche. With the introduction of the internet, oddities continue to rise. Etsy stores capitalize on the niche market of oddities, and web stars such as musician Aurelio Voltaire create tutorials and share links for creating a darker lifestyle inspired by Victorian oddity culture as well. While some believe oddity culture to be on the decline, the internet provides a massive marketplace for the continuation of dealing in darkness. Places that once ignored historical significance in favor of curiosity appeal are now historically significant in themselves. Barnum's Museum is registered as a historical landmark, while the Stanley family's Curiosity Shop prides itself in its protection of its authenticity. Meanwhile, in places where history is slowly fading, there is a massive pushback. Places like Coney Island, Venice Beach are seeing a strong community fighting for the preservation of landmark sideshows and the culture surrounding. With the steady decline and gentrification of places that hold oddities such as Venice Beach, it is easy to believe the culture of oddity is slowly dying. However, once again, Robert Ripley begs to differ. Not only has Ripley Enterprises once again successfully made it to the household television screen, but the steady business of established oddity storehouses shows a continuation of the culture of curating curiosities. However, the appeal is now once again in preservation. The conservation and preservation of oddity culture, as well as cultivation of understanding, is of the utmost importance. Within both the unique culture created by fascination with the strange and the greater historical preservation community, the understanding and recognition of oddities as commodities is incredibly important. Thank you all for listening, and for more information, I recommend checking out either these sources or going to your local library and checking Dewey Decimal Call numbers 301 for anthropological history or 069 for museum studies. Once again, thank you so much, and have a great rest of your conference.